My name is Peter Murphy. I'll be chairing this evening session of Politics in the Pub, so it's great to see you here for another good night of hopefully a bit intense but a very enjoyable discussion about important issues to us. I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're on here tonight. That's the Gadigal people of the Great Eora Nation, and pay respect to their elders past and present. The topic tonight is the 2016 federal budget, next Tuesday's federal budget, what's on the menu and what should be on it. And we've got two well-known speakers for you tonight, but really well informed on this debate that's I don't know, it's amusing the country, it's making people angry, and it's the testing up for the election campaign to July 2. So the first speaker tonight will be Professor Frank Stilwell from the University of Sydney. I see you know him very well, but he's written so many books and articles about our country's economics, our society's way of working together, and the need for urban planning, the need for equality, the challenge of social justice. And the second speaker is Dr. Ben Spies-Butcher from Macquarie University, and also a specialist in social welfare and social justice issues in economics. So let's have Frank Stilwell. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Well, there's never been a more exciting time to be Malcolm Turnbull. And next Tuesday will be very exciting for his Treasurer, Scott Morrison, too, because that's when he'll be delivering the federal budget for the year ahead. You might remember the widely reported dance for joy that Treasurer Joe Hockey did when he delivered his first budget in 2014. In his office, before he walked into the Parliament, he did a little jig in the company of some of his family members, which seemed, in the light of the reception of the budget subsequently, to be thoroughly inappropriate, and indeed one of the things that he was pilloried for, because that budget was widely condemned as grossly unfair, and I think with the benefit of hindsight we can see it politically as the beginning of the end for the Abbott government. Will the people be dancing for joy next Tuesday? I very much doubt it. Neither Ben Spies-Butcher nor I know what will be in Treasurer Scott Morrison's budget, but I think both of us will be presenting tonight some rather jaundiced observations. Deeply constructive, critical, analytical perspectives, which will suggest, on the whole, that there are major economic, political and social challenges that need to be confronted, but which this budget is unlikely to contribute positively to. Now, budgets are useful, of course. Yes, they are statements of purpose and intent. They involve estimating the likely revenues and government expenditures over the year ahead, and they involve some marginal adjustments which are designed to change the volume and pattern of those income and expenditure flows. Things don't always work out as planned, of course, so budgets aren't, in some sense, cast iron, rigid planning documents. Rather, they are, as I've said, statements of intent, but we can infer from them what is the political purpose and the economic strategy of the incumbent government. And with an election looming up, that judgment will be, I think, rather important to the prospects for this government's re-election. So when faced with budgets, I always ask 4 questions. One is macroeconomic in character. Is the budget appropriate in the prevailing economic circumstances? The second is distributional. Who gains, who loses? The third is allocative. In other words, looking at the allocation of the government's resources. It's the revenues that it's generated, how much is being spent on health, education, defence, and so forth. And fourthly, a rather characteristically green question, what impact will all this have on the environment and the prospects for reconciling economic goals with ecological sustainability? Malcolm Turnbull talks a lot about the need to restructure our economy, to transition to some new economic arrangements. So I think it is pertinent to ask whether or not there's anything here that will involve transition to an ecologically sustainable future, as well as the more equitable and fair society that politicians want to talk about but seldom to deliver on. But of course, in the current political context, there's a further question to ask about the budget. Is it politically saleable? What will it do to enhance or undermine the prospects for the government's chances of re-election? The aspect that I want to put particular focus on, though, is the so-called national conversation on tax reform that has led up to this current budgetary process. Because you may recall about 6 months ago, Malcolm Turnbull, wanting to distance himself from his blatantly reactionary predecessor, Tony Abbott, called for a national conversation on tax reform. This, I infer, was supposed to illustrate how he wanted to make a fresh start, to demonstrate his small L liberal credentials, his public intelligence in engaging with important issues that would have a major bearing on the future of Australian society. A national conversation on tax reform sounded like a good initiative. But of course, as we all know, it's turned out to be a flaming disaster. A debacle, really. The Prime Minister doesn't even seem to have been conversing regularly with his own Treasurer. Rather, they've been singing from different song sheets, or to further mix the metaphors, sometimes setting tax reform hares running in multiple directions without any coherent sense of progress. We've lived through 6 months of that, and I'm going to in a moment briefly try and summarise some of the important milestones. God, I nearly said millstones there. My father, whenever he had a birthday coming up and said, just another millstone on life's journey. And I think that applies in this case here. Because there are, broadly speaking, 5 elements in the current situation that's emerged out of the so-called national conversation on tax reform. First and foremost, there is, I think, a growing recognition of a big economic problem. Look, there's a lot of uncertainty out there in the international economy. China is in some difficulties. The prospects of a crash landing after its long period of spectacular economic growth cannot be discounted. Europe, well, the prospects for financial stability and steady growth look decidedly shaky at the current time. Japan attempts to re-stimulate the economy, look like they've failed. Russia, Brazil in recession. Economists talking commonly about the prospects of, or possibility at least, of another global financial crash comparable to 2008, 2009. these are not propitious times in the world economy. And here in Australia, we know growing difficulties, the mining boom over, manufacturing industry somewhat in the doldrums, the closure of the car industry coming up, steel in trouble. The list goes on. It's sometimes seen that only the building and construction industry has been keeping the economy pumping along. And even there, in Sydney and Melbourne, the main centres of that activity, there's evidence of a downturn, deflationary pressures coming through the housing market, more generally into the economy, creating a situation of profound economic uncertainty. And the growing federal budget deficit is, I think, one illustration of that. Now, I hasten to say that there's nothing wrong with running a budgetary deficit. Most Australian households do this, at least for considerable periods of their lifetimes, to buy houses. Tradespeople typically do it to buy tools or a truck so that they can set themselves up in a revenue and income earning position, generating income that then is used to pay the interest on the debt that they've incurred to buy the truck or the tools, and then pay off the principal down the track. There's nothing wrong with debt from an economic point of view. But of course, if it becomes too large as a result of periodic deficits with expenditures exceeding income, then you get large interest payments, even ultimately a debt trap where so much of the current income is incurred in paying off the interest on past debts that stymies the possibility of doing anything productive in the period ahead. And there's no doubt that the federal budget deficit is increasing year by year. So what's to be done? What is the appropriate macroeconomic stance for the budget in those circumstances? Well, on becoming Treasurer, Scott Morrison made the amazing statement that there is no revenue problem in Australia. He's wavered around that position ever since, but it seems to have come back and indeed been the centre of gravity in his thinking about budgetary policy. Well, if there's no revenue problem, the only way of dealing with a growing budgetary deficit is to cut spending. And that is, of course, what Joe Hockey did in his first budget, and that created that public turmoil to which I earlier referred. It's political suicide, I think, in the current circumstances, as well as economically irresponsible to go down that road. I presume that in private conversations between Turnbull and his ignorant treasurer, that he will be advising a more steady as she goes path that accepts the reality of growing fiscal deficits. Well, perhaps that may be wise in the circumstances, to let the budget deficit to continue to grow. But there's another major political danger in that, because this is what they promised not to do. We can recall one of the millstones hanging around Tony Abbott's neck was that his policies in practice were not what he promised when he offered himself as the alternative Prime Minister. Well, now we've got Turnbull falling into the same situation. Turnbull and Morrison have promised to rein in the budgetary deficit, but now there doesn't seem to be any alternative to them to run a continuing deficit growth. The second element in the jigsaw is the commitment to lower company tax. Now, of course, I immediately say, well, that only makes the deficit problem more difficult. But it seems to be a very strong commitment based upon that neoliberal belief that if you cut company taxes, that will increase business investment, that will generate jobs and be a stimulus for economic growth. But frankly, this is trickle-down economics taken beyond reasonable credulity. The claim that company tax cuts would boost jobs and growth depends upon a positive behavioural response that flies in the face of experience. What businesses do depends not on the headline rate of company tax, which is 30%, but on the rate that they actually pay. And in many cases, this is very little. Australian Tax Office data released in late 2015 showed that 579 companies in Australia with a combined turnover of $406 billion paid no tax at all in the preceding year. Now, I'm not inferring that there's anything illegal about this. Rather, it was a matter of using every trick in the book for sophisticated tax minimisation. And it seems to me, as an observer of these processes, that it's the closure of the loopholes that enables companies to avoid taxation that needs to be the priority, not the cutting of a headline corporate tax rate, which very few companies actually pay anyway. The straightforwardly obvious effect of actually cutting the headline company tax rate is to produce greater imbalance in the income shares of capital and labour, and therefore greater after-tax economic inequality, thereby worsening the tendency to growing inequality that's already evident in Australian society. And of course, it would simultaneously reduce total revenue and increase the government's budgetary deficit. The beneficiaries are the corporate elites and the big shareholders. The losers are the rest of the people who either have to make up for those lost revenues in more taxes that they pay or suffer the effects of deteriorating government services and infrastructure spending. The next element in the jigsaw, the next millstone, so to speak, is lower income taxes at the top or middle and top end of the income tax range. Turnbull and Morrison have been talking a lot about the problem of bracket creep. And it's certainly true that as a result of inflationary processes, people do tend to move into higher marginal tax rates, even if the real value of their incomes has not increased. That's the so-called problem of bracket creep. But here is the irony that, in fact, this tendency is at a historically low level. Inflation is remarkably low in current times. Indeed, even deflationary pressures are evident as we read about in the newspapers over the last 24 hours. So the problem of bracket creep, of pushing people into higher marginal tax rates, is almost trivial at present. But in any case, if governments really wanted to alleviate this problem once and for all they need to do is to index the income tax rates to changes in the inflation rate. Then that automatically would eliminate bracket creep forevermore. They don't do it, of course, because historically they've depended on this as a fairly reliable source of a slow but steady increase in government revenue without formally increasing any tax rates. At a time of growing budget deficits, to again re-emphasise that argument, it seems bizarre, though, to be cutting income taxes at all. Recall, it was Treasurer Peter Costello's income tax cuts during the period of the Howard government that got us into the budgetary deficit problem in the first place. The budgetary deficits weren't immediately evident then, but Costello's actions had the effect, in the fullness of time, of hamstringing the government's capacity to raise the revenue necessary to deal with government expenditure commitments after the mining boom had ended. It was an incredibly short-sighted and politically opportunistic policy. My partner has warned me against describing Peter Costello as an economic criminal, but it is hard to avoid any other conclusion. Sorry, Anne. I'm moving to a conclusion, but a couple of the points are quick and strong. One concerns the GST. You remember that came on the table of discussion during the National Conversation on Tax for about 3 or 4 weeks. And indeed, it would have been the answer to dealing with the budgetary deficit growth. A big increase in the GST would have done the trick. But of course, Labor immediately pounced on that, saying that it would be inequitable because GST increase would have been a regressive tax, hitting the poor harder than the wealthy. And Turnbull clearly made the judgment, overruling his treasurer, that this was not a way to go. So on the table and off the table for that one. But for how long? If the Turnbull government is re-elected, and possibly even if Labor is elected, I would predict that it's only a matter of time before that again comes under active consideration as a means, the most obvious and straightforward means of addressing the federal fiscal deficit. But when Turnbull took it off the table, he put something else on, only that something else only lasted for about 72 hours. That was shifting the problem onto the state governments through a reform of federal-state fiscal relationships. In other words, opening up the opportunity that state governments would levy additional income taxes in order to meet their growing expenditure commitments for education, health, and so forth. But of course, the state premiers wouldn't buy that, with the exception of Western Australia, which thought it would enhance their regional autonomy. The other state premiers thought, no way are we going to cop this transfer of the fiscal stress from the federal government onto state government responsibilities. Well, it's when you look back on these different milestones or millstones in the so-called conversation on tax reform, it's not surprising that we wound up in such a policy vacuum. Actually, the Labor Party have embraced some positive responses. They seem to have a much more coherent agenda, emphasising cuts in capital gains taxation, reduction in the tax rorts associated with negative gearing, moving on, closing off some of the superannuation arrangements that mostly benefit upper income earners, and so forth. And indeed, there are many other possibilities of progressive tax reform. Inheritance taxes, land taxes, these are potentially potent and equitable ways of dealing with the stresses that I've described. But the Liberal Party, the coalition government more generally, won't embrace those progressive measures. They are still the captives of the big end of town, the corporate elites, the wealthy classes in Australian society, which only makes the political question sharper. Can they get away with it? Ladies and gentlemen, I hope not.